Welcome to our second digital talk on the US election. This AIS talk is possible due to the support of the Austrian-American Partnership Fund, which promotes collaboration and cultural exchange between Austrian and US non-governmental organizations. Our aim is to conduct multiple digital talks in the next weeks with high-ranking specialists and experts covering the US election in order to increase the awareness about the ongoing political processes in the United States, here in Austria, and in Europe. Today, with me is Stan Sloan, a good friend of our institute and one of America's top experts on the transatlantic relations. He's also the founding director of the Atlantic Community Initiative, and his most recent book is quite interesting. We are going to touch upon it later on. It's called Defense of the West. Stan has many affiliations, but I would like just to mention two most recent ones. He's visiting scholar in political science at the Middlebury College, Vermont, and he's also non-resident senior fellow in the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council of the United States. As you can guess from our title, today we ask the question, will Joe Biden win the US election? But before I give the floor to my dear friend Stan Sloan, I would like to also mention that he has more than 30 years of public service to various functions. He began his career in the public service, serving as NATO and European Community Desk Officer. He was member of the US delegation to the Vienna negotiations on mutual and balanced force reductions. He was also employed by the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress in a variety of analytical and research management positions. And he is, by the way, also a distinguished graduate of the Air Force Officers Training School and served as a commissioned officer in the United States Air Force. Now, you see that my guest has a tremendous career, and he can actually cover today a lot of questions that our listeners and watchers have. But I would start with my first question, which is, what are your personal expectations for these US elections? What could be the consequences depending on Joe Biden's win of the US presidential election? The floor is yours, Stan.
Thank you, Velina, and it's great to be working with you again. I think the last time was last September in 2019 when I came to Vienna, and we had a great meeting to discuss actually some of these questions about the future of the transatlantic relationship. And so we have another opportunity to do that today. The question that is posed by the title of the session is a big one. I'm not an expert on elections, but I have to admit I've been following the course of this campaign very closely. And I also have to admit I have my own biases, as almost all Americans do. We're very divided right now as a country. There are very few people that are in that category of undecided. In fact, when someone says they're undecided, a lot of people raise their eyebrows and say, how can you be undecided? Either you have to be pro-Trump or anti-Trump, pro-Biden or anti-Biden. But I have, in the last couple of days, taken a very close look at the polling. And right now, the question seems to be, how large a margin might Joe Biden have in a victory over President Trump? All of the polls are pointing in that direction. Now, we have to take into account the fact that in 2016, at this point, polls were suggesting that that Hillary Clinton would win the presidency. In some ways, the polls were correct. She certainly won the popular vote, but President Trump managed to get enough of a victory in a couple of key states in order to win the outcome in the Electoral College. And that's why we have had President Trump for the last 4 years. Some interesting analysis of the current polling includes the fact that if you factor in the degree to which polls were inaccurate in 2016, Joe Biden still ends up with a winning margin both in the popular vote and in the Electoral College. Right now, the popular vote is Biden looks to be leading in the polls by around 10%. There are lots of different polls, obviously. Some are 8 or 9, some are 12 or 14, but the average is around 10%. That's a very large lead, and it averages out over 50% of the likely voters. And so it's a fairly clear picture at this point. And we've got 3 weeks to go before the outcome. In fact, we don't know exactly when we'll know the outcome because so many people are voting by absentee ballot and early voting that the outcome may not be known as normally. There's a projection made on the night of the voting. Most people expect that the various people who make projections will not be able to do so on the night of November the 3rd, that everyone will have to wait perhaps longer. And a lot depends on how quickly states count the absentee ballots or the mail-in ballots, and that's going to make for a fascinating time here in the United States. Let me just make one more comment about what the polls are showing, and that is that a couple of the states that were critical to Trump's victory, where he eked out a small margin in votes, are leaning to or very strongly in the Biden column this time around. And at this point, most of the projections that I've seen show the Electoral College outcome as strongly favoring Biden. And again, things could change. What might change? Well, one of the big issues, obviously, perhaps the biggest issue, is the question of how the president has handled the pandemic. And the polls show in this regard that most Americans, a strong majority of Americans, believe that the pandemic, COVID-19, has not been well handled in the United States. And that is why both our hospitalizations and our death rates are currently rising again, as unfortunately they are in several European countries as well. And the fact that the president still tends to downplay, and in fact even brags about downplaying the threat of the COVID-19, as he did at a rally just last night in Florida, suggests that he's not going to change his approach. And if he doesn't change his approach, the question is how will anyone else be convinced to move over to his side? So he has to, in order to win at this point, he would have to convince people to switch from their preference for Biden over to a preference for him. And there was some question about whether, when he was diagnosed with COVID-19, whether the experience would lead him to take a more serious approach to dealing with the pandemic. It appears that that has not had that impact, that he in fact has decided that he will claim that he has a huge victory over the virus. And there even was one, I don't know whether it's an accurate report, but some said that when he was scheduled to come out of Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, or outside Washington, that he wanted to wear a Superman t-shirt under his shirt and then tear off his shirt and show that he was a Superman because he had defeated the virus. He obviously decided not to do that, but in many ways he's taking that approach, and he's bragging that he's defeated the virus. He claims, perhaps inaccurately, that he now is immune. Most doctors say we don't know that yet, and if there is immunity, we don't know for how long. But in any case, there we are. So 3 weeks from the election, it looks at this point as if Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. But nothing is certain until the votes are counted.
Mm-hmm. In your second edition, just recent edition of your highly interesting book, Defense of the West, Transatlantic Security from Truman to Trump. I mean, the title reveals itself that this edition looks at how developments inside NATO, but also European Union member states affect their ability to defend against external threats while preserving the Western values in the era of Trump. So actually, this book also addresses failures and shortcomings of Western institutions and member states. And of course, on this side of the Atlantic, one major question is, will the transatlantic relationship get better in case of Joe Biden's win? And what is your assessment? What are your expectations in terms of the impact that this U.S. presidential election outcome will have on the relations between United States and European Union member states, so basically the European powers, but also when it comes to the transatlantic community as a whole, because one thing is clear, the COVID-19 pandemic did not spare the transatlantic relationship.
In my professional judgment, the outcome of the election will have a very large impact on transatlantic relations. This is not anything very dramatic or exciting to say, but as we all know, President Trump has been very skeptical about both NATO and the European Union. He has claimed that both organizations the members of both organizations have taken advantage of the United States over the years. The European Union has done it, according to his approach, through its trade practices, taking advantage of the United States. And the NATO allies have done it as a result of their insufficient contributions to defense. And so one would have to anticipate that this approach would continue under a second Trump administration, that if it changes at all, one would have to expect that it would change in the direction of even more critical approaches toward NATO and toward the European Union. Now, if you look at what Vice President Biden has said and has written, and there's a lot out there now in a foreign policy article and elsewhere where he has laid out his views, he has suggested that his top priority will in fact be rebuilding the transatlantic relationship. When Biden was a senator and I was working at the Congressional Research Service, I did quite a few studies at his request of transatlantic relations, and then he would publish them as committee prints in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate. And so I've worked very closely with him. I know exactly what his commitments are to transatlantic relations. I know that he believes that the United States is stronger when it has good relations with its allies. He frequently says that we're stronger together, meaning stronger when the United States works with its allies. And so I anticipate that one of the first priorities of a Biden administration would be to try to stabilize the American position internationally, and that would lead with trying to restore the trust and faith in the United States among our allies. Now, that said, given all of the problems of recent years, that will not be easy. It will not come easily, and I wouldn't expect Europeans immediately to say, oh, good, it's Biden, so we can trust the United States now, even though that is obviously what he would like, and that would be his objective. There were problems, as we know, in the relationship before Trump came along, and there will be problems afterwards. And I think the main difference is one of approach, and the rebuilding of confidence in the alliance is critical in the U.S.-EU relationship. They go together in that sense because they're critical parts of the transatlantic relationship. Wolfgang Ischinger has been saying lately, and he didn't create the saying, but he's been saying lately that trust is the currency of diplomacy. Now, I would add to that trust is the currency of democratic alliances. That democracies, if you have an alliance among countries that are not democracies, power can be the currency of those relationships. But in an alliance like NATO and in the transatlantic relationship, more generally, trust is critically important. And I think that will be the top priority for President Biden, to try to restore a degree of trust, at least in the eyes of Europeans, being able to trust the United States to do what it says it's going to do, and to do it along with allies rather than separate from them. And this is perhaps part of a bigger question. Another thing that President Trump has done is shown his skepticism about international organizations and international cooperation in general. And the alliance part has been a subset of that. But in general, he has taken a negative attitude toward the United Nations, and particularly some of its sub-organizations like the World Health Organization, which has been at the center of Trump skepticism recently. And this suggests that Biden will, I think, try to restore not just the relations with our allies, but also restore American leadership and a positive attitude toward multilateral cooperation in general, and the United Nations and other international organizations in particular.
Mm-hmm. In your older book, Transatlantic Traumas, you addressed the issue of illiberalism and how illiberalism, in fact, brought the West to the brink of collapse. You're discussing very important issues there, not only the issue of populism, but also the issue of rising authoritarianism, such as the one coming from countries as Russia or Turkey. And now we have also, during the COVID-19 virus outbreak, the issue of the rise of China, which is another example of illiberalism, and how actually China coped with the crisis. On the one side, it managed the crisis well inwards. However, question still remains open as to how it helped the global community in tackling the crisis. If we look at the devastating consequences on both sides of the Atlantic, and as you've mentioned at the beginning, both Europe and United States are right now still in the middle of a second wave of COVID-19. Now, the question I have is, what are your expectations in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, if given that Joe Biden would win the U.S. election, so given that it would be a Democratic president? We know also that during the Obama administration, there were in fact already certain policies launched by Obama as to how to cope with the rise of China, mostly in terms of institutional approaches. Let me just give the example with the TTIP, the trade bloc between Europe and America, or the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was basically a similar trade bloc meant with Asian states and United States. So what do you expect in terms of the future relations between United States and China, depending on this election outcome?
No matter who wins, the relationship will remain troubled, because there are certain things about China that must be troubling to the West. And some of them are political, some of them have to do with the approach that China has to governance of its people and how that translates also into its foreign policy, and also about its practices in the area of trade, particularly in which its internal control system gives it advantages in dealing with the outside world that have been rejected by governments around the world. The difference, I think, and let me just back up and say that President Trump believed that by establishing a close personal relationship with Xi, the Chinese leader, that in fact he could manage the relationship. That obviously was going getting in trouble even before the pandemic. The pandemic sealed the fate of the relationship under the current president because it basically demonstrated that in spite of his supposedly friendly relationship with the Chinese leader, that China would just make its own decisions about policies. And of course, the president now, every time he refers to COVID-19, he calls it the China virus. And so it's very clear what his approach is. And the interesting thing during the campaign has been that both Democrats and Republicans have been trying to avoid the criticism that they're being too soft on China. And so both Republicans and Democrats want to take a hard line toward China because of concerns about internal management of the country, which is more of an issue for Democrats, and also the trade policies taking advantage of the United States and, for that matter, other countries. So the campaign it's interesting that China has not become a big issue, in part because of the fact that the Democrats have their own criticisms of China, and now President Trump has no interest in claiming a great friendship or special angle on dealing with China, because for that matter, his approach to trade has basically failed, I think most would say, and so he's back to square one in many ways. What is Biden going to do? The first thing Biden is going to do, and this is where everything about Biden tends to link together and go back to multilateralism and traditional allies, because the first thing that he's going to do is try to establish more of a common approach to China with our allies. And he's been very explicit about this, and it's consistent with what we know both about Joe Biden and about the support of the campaign staff and potential officials that he has working with him. And so that is the first step. And in many ways, reestablishing cooperation with allies is sort of the key to the Biden approach to almost everything internationally. That's where he's starting. And I think as the first year of the Biden administration will be one in which he tries to establish stability and predictability in America's role in the world. So this will apply to China as well. And I'm wondering, one thing that I think that if the United States is going to develop a common approach with its allies, it needs some kind of a concept. And the concept I would suggest, and this is just my personal suggestion, and it shows my experience in the NATO context, my recommendation is for the United States to advocate for the allies to come up with something that looks like a Harmel approach to China. And Harmel was the approach during the Cold War that the allies agreed to take an approach to the Soviet Union that featured both competition, and defense and détente was the language that was used at that time. And in many ways, that continues to be the approach that the allies take toward Russia, looking for cooperation when it's possible, but defending against the threats posed by Russia. In many ways, this could be a framework, this kind of an approach could be the framework for the United States and its allies to take. It's more complex, obviously, because even though the Allies have some dependence on Russia because of energy, the fact is that both Europe and the United States have huge dependencies on the economic and financial relationship with China. And so we are in a position where I never thought a total conflicted relationship with China could make sense for Western countries, because in the United States in particular, that China was holding and still is holding very significant amounts of American debt. And so it always meant that there was a mutual dependency between the United States and China. So it means that we're not always in the strongest of position in dealing with China. And perhaps the best way to strengthen the position is exactly the way that Biden suggests, and that is to work with allies and to come up with common approaches to understand that China is not going to go away. It's not going to go away economically, financially, or strategically. And so we need to find a way to deal with that. And at the same time, I think it is necessary, if we believe in the West and what we say we believe in, it is necessary to make sure we make it clear that we do not approve of the internal political system of China. We should make it clear that we don't seek unilaterally to change that system, but when there are human rights violations and policies that China takes toward its people or minorities inside its boundaries, that in fact we feel free to criticize, but not try to get involved in influencing internal change. So there's a fine line to be drawn there, and it's one that I think that the Biden administration will try to draw with its allies.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned several times one key word, which is multilateralism, and clearly the expectation is that the US election outcome will have a serious impact on the global order and on existent multilateral institutions. Now, you've also mentioned several times already China and also Russia, and given that Russia, China, and the West do not share the same understanding when it comes to the concept of multilateralism. However, they are all participants in the existent multilateral structures. I would like to ask you to touch upon this issue. What would be your assessment when it comes to the possible impact of the US election outcome on the future of global order as well as multilateralism? We've observed an increasing pressure coming from Russia and China at the UN level. That means within UN institutions, so within the United Nations structure. We've also observed coordinated actions and measures, and we also observed overlapping geopolitical interests when they obviously tried and are trying to basically create a counterweight to the US influence in international relations. And with that respect, how do you expect that Biden, as a potential winner from the US election, would address these issues? And what is your expectation also for the further development of the global order? Do you expect rather a multipolarity in which the United States will try to slide back into more like Obama administration's international goals, such as the ones I mentioned, and you've also outlined in terms of institutional cooperation, in terms of strengthening certain partnerships and alliances? Or do you expect also additional initiatives coming out from the new administration? What is your expectation on that issues?
Well, as you know, in my book Transatlantic Traumas, I identified the fact that both Russia and China wanted to change the international system, believing that the Western security system had put them at a disadvantage. And so we know that they both would like to substitute different international systems for the one that has been basically dominated by the Western countries. And so we know that there is a challenge, it has been a challenge. We also know that one of the things I think the Biden people will be very careful about is making sure that they don't do things that tend to push China and Russia together. Will be an attempt, I think, to differentiate policies and approaches to the two countries, even while opposing the approaches that the two of them have toward the international system. So the multilateral approach that I think the Biden administration is likely to take is one that will value international institutions. That means recognizing that both China and Russia play important roles in those institutions, that the institutions may not always work well because of the fact that China and or Russia will take different approaches than the United States and the European Union. And that, so I think that the approach the Biden will take will be very positive toward multilateral organizations, but also sanguine and pragmatic about what the possibilities are. And so that I think would be the way to characterize the likely Biden approach. I think they have been somewhat careful in their campaign not to go too far down the road in terms of defending international organizations, but it's very clear that their approach is very positive. They've already indicated that on day one, the United States will rejoin the World Health Organization. They've indicated that they will seek to negotiate a new agreement with allies on Iran, on Iran's nuclear program. There have been many, many indications coming out from the Biden campaign about things on the agenda. So I think that will tend to bring the United States back into the game. In many ways, the Trump administration has taken the United States out of the game, out of the international system. And that has been reflected in the attitude toward the organizations, attitude toward other countries, attitude toward our allies. I think that what the administration has done toward relations with Germany has been most destructive and made U.S. cooperation with Europe much more difficult. Therefore, this is a huge rebuilding project for the Biden administration. And I don't think we should expect that they will manage to overcome all of the problems in the near term. But as I suggested earlier, their first priority will be to try to stabilize and make more predictable the U.S. role in the international system. And whether this will then lead to United States leadership being restored in that system remains to be seen. The expectation of many internationally during the Trump administration has been that the United States has abdicated leadership. The Biden administration will try to bring leadership back, but I think it will also be open to sharing leadership responsibilities. And I don't mean leading from behind, I mean sharing leadership responsibilities with the European Union, with other Western powers, Japan, for example, South Korea. And one of the big changes, of course, will be the Biden administration, instead of making a point of attacking Germany, Japan, South Korea, and other allies, it will make a point of cooperating with them, even when we have differences. And there will be differences. But I think that will be the major change from the Trump administration's approach to the international system.
Mm-hmm. Stan, you also mentioned Germany, and obviously one of the key issues in the troubled relationship between the United States and Europe within the transatlantic community, but also outside of it during the Trump's administration was basically the personal relationship between Trump and Merkel, which was really at its lowest, but also the deteriorating relationship between Germany and the United States. So my question to you is, do you expect that Joe Biden, as a potential winner, would actually try to, first and foremost, get this relationship better, but also would Joe Biden actually support a stronger European pillar within NATO, basically a kind of a sort of a partial emancipation of Europe within in the field of security and defense, so basically within the transatlantic community, which Trump vehemently was opposed to, as we know. And I mean, we know also that he wasn't a big fan of NATO, but also not big fan of European Union. So how do you think that Joe Biden would approach this issue? Obviously, Europeans are right now at the crossroads, so to say, in terms of how to cope with their own basically security and defense policy, so that they are also contributing in a more efficient way to the transatlantic community. So what is your take on that matters?
Big question. Let me start with the smaller question, and that is the relationship with Merkel. Of course, she will not be chancellor forever, and so the question will be obviously how Biden deals with her successor as well as dealing with her. The fact is that I think that the relationship between the United States and Germany will improve almost instantly with Biden as president. It doesn't mean it will resolve all of the issues of problems. And the fact is that the Trump administration has so badly damaged the U.S. image in Germany. If you look at the public opinion polls, it's scary to see what Germans think about the United States now, and in fact, scary to see what Europeans think about the United States now. And although I would say that the views in Europe are largely views of the United States under a Trump administration, and those views are echoed by the Americans that oppose the Trump administration. So there may be more common ground there for Biden to build on. Now, in terms of the European pillar in the alliance, I have to reflect back a little bit on history. In the early 1980s, I wrote actually what was the first book in this series of which the new edition is the latest. But in 1983-4, I wrote a book called NATO's Future, Toward a New Transatlantic Bargain. I think I was the first one that used that term, New Transatlantic Bargain. The term transatlantic bargain had been around for a while, but I added the new to it. What was the new transatlantic bargain? What I argued for in the 1980s was a transatlantic alliance in which the Europeans were more cohesive inside the alliance and actually did constitute a pillar inside the alliance. I made the clear point that the way for it to be successful would be for that pillar to be inside the transatlantic relationship, not outside it. And that, since that time, has been a problem because there have been tendencies in some areas in Europe to create a pillar that is basically outside of that relationship. We've seen it particularly from Paris because that has been the independent inclination of not just de Gaulle, but of subsequent French leaders as well, that the tendency to, when building up a European pillar, to build it up in many ways in opposition to American power and American dominance. So I understand the motivations and the rationales for the French approach and for those elsewhere in Europe who share that approach. But to my mind and my judgment, that is not what will be in the best interest of Europe and the United States. That said, clearly, I think Biden, knowing some of the views of many of his advisors, and the burden sharing question that we talk about is not going to go away. Americans will still want Europeans to do more on behalf of their own defense, to make larger actual contributions to security in Europe. And so that won't change, except the approach to doing it will change. Instead of the American government beating up on Europeans, criticizing them, attacking them, as in many ways the Trump administration has done, or at least President Trump has done. I have to say, in some ways, below the level of the president, his subordinate officers, Secretary of State, Secretaries of Defense, he's had several in both cases, have been more modest in their approach to dealing with the allies and more friendly in some ways. And so the United States has not taken some of the more dramatic steps that might have been suggested by Trump's rhetoric. My concern about Biden, even though he will do away with that kind of an approach, it'll be a much more cooperative work with the allies approach. The Biden administration will expect the Europeans to continue to improve their defense contributions to the alliance. Their argument will be, if you don't do that, you could get another Trump down the road. And there is a good argument to be made that the burden sharing argument was one thing that sold the Trump approach to some Americans. No question about that. And that's not going to disappear. And even a very modest centrist Americans believe that Europe should do more. So the burden sharing issue is not going to go away. My ironic concern about the Biden administration has to do with a mistake that I think the Obama administration made. The mistake that I think that they made was to believe that Europe could do more than it actually could do. And I don't mean this in economic terms. I mean this in political terms. I think there was a belief reflected in Obama administration policies that if the United States encouraged and even praised Europe for unity and pushed Europe toward more unity, that it would happen. I think that was a total misreading of political realities in Europe. My reading of political realities is that the United States policy, even though the United States was critical to the beginning of the process of European integration in the 1950s, American support, particularly starting with the Marshall Plan, but continuing for quite a few years after that, was very supportive of the process of European integration. But I don't think, in my judgment today, whether the United States opposes or supports further European integration is not going to determine the outcome of the integration process. I believe there are serious political obstacles that the Europeans themselves put up. I think what has been accomplished in the European Union is spectacular and is very positive. But to expect that the European Union can then go to the next step of actually creating something like a European Defense Union, a European Army, all of that is, I think, unrealistic. And it's unrealistic because none of those defense aspects can be possible until Europe has a federal union, till Europe is a unitary actor internationally. And I don't see countries accepting that. I see some European countries that would be more interested than others in going to that point. But in most European countries, particularly in the larger ones, and now obviously the UK is sort of out of that picture, but I still see with France and Germany and Poland and other European countries an approach that suggests that going to that next stage of actually becoming a fully united, politically united Europe is not in the immediate future. I don't see it happening right away. So I don't think the United States should count on that happening right away and should encourage levels of increased cooperation among the Europeans on defense without expecting that it will get to the point of being totally unified. One thing that people neglect when talking about Europe's reliance on the United States is that going to the next stage of some kind of European defense union under a European federal state, going to that next stage requires European states to rely on each other to depend on each other, because it would mean smaller countries giving up parts of their defense efforts and relying on their neighbors to provide those elements of defense that they may think are still important. And that I don't see, there has been progress in Europe in developing multilateral internal European cooperation, where countries demonstrated some willingness to rely on their neighbors to provide certain aspects of defense. But that hasn't gotten to the point where you have that full trust inside Europe of one another to move dramatically in that integrative direction.
Mm-hmm. Stan, I see a few questions coming from the audience sent to me, and I will ask three of them as I see that we don't have much time left. One question relates to the Vice President candidate Kamala Harris. What is your take on her as the potential Vice President? Which will be her most important fields where she will try to make a difference, and could we see her as a positive role model following the failed president's candidacy by Hillary Clinton, which now could be basically covered by Kamala Harris? That's one question. So basically relating to female leadership in US politics. Then there is, of course, there are questions related to Europe once again. One is about disinformation. Now, disinformation and hybrid trends are back to the political agenda. And that is something that has been already in place during the Cold War. So if there is one organization that is really well equipped with dealing with these kind of issues, that is NATO. So how do you see that the United States will be engaged in coping with these issues, particularly under Joe Biden's presidency? And final question, of course, once again about multilateralism and the multilateral approach. What would be, in your expectation, the approach of Joe Biden towards the JCPOA? Will the United States go back to the Iran deal, where the European powers, but also China and Russia are still very much on track and want to save it? And do you expect that the United States would be more actively engaged in the direct neighborhood of Europe, the neighborhood to the south, where European powers are facing a series of tensions and military conflicts, but also to the east with the well-known assertive regional player Russia, and with an increasingly assertive regional player Turkey?
Wow, three great questions. I'll very briefly start with the first one. Kamala Harris, the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket. I have to first make an admission. I actually, before she dropped out of the competition for the nomination to be the presidential candidate, I was a supporter of Kamala Harris. It's part of my broader belief in the fact that we need more women involved in taking senior positions. And sorry, I have to clear my screen. Thinks I haven't been busy, so I had to tell it not to go anywhere. I'm a very strong supporter of Kamala Harris, and this is part of my belief that we need more strong and effective women in government. To some extent, you can see that much more effectively applied in Europe. I think it's coming in the United States, and we have so many smart, effective women who now are getting in or already in politics, and I think she is a lead one. I think because I supported her for the presidential nomination, if in fact she becomes the presidential nominee in 2024, I think it will be a good thing for the United States. I think it's a good thing both for the role of women and also the role of minorities in our political system. So I think she's very strong, very good. She'll make a very good vice president. On the question of disinformation, there's no question about it, and it's something that I addressed without necessarily using that catchword in transatlantic traumas. But the fact is that Russia has been very actively involved in providing disinformation, not just in the American election 2016 and now, but it also has been very involved in supporting radical right populist parties and politicians in Europe with money, covert assistance. I think it's pretty well documented at this point that Russia was providing assistance to the Brexit campaign in the UK, believing, and very clear, that this was something that was a high priority for Putin, and that was to support Brexit, because Putin believes that the European Union and the UK are both weaker with the UK out of the European Union. The future, I think that the Biden administration will definitely want NATO to put more focus on responding to and providing the correctives for initiative or kind of intrusion by Russia in particular. The problem is, of course, that a lot of this has to be done on the national level, not on the NATO level. I think NATO needs to provide strong support for national attempts to counter the Russian disinformation, and they can do that by putting even more effort into its information program and efforts. And I think that the Biden administration will take a very strong position on this. I think Biden administration is very sensitive to the fact that not only defense efforts in terms of military hardware are important, but the political side of the alliance is just as important in terms of maintaining a strong defense and support for the objectives of the alliance. After all, the alliance is an ideological alliance as well as a military alliance. The North Atlantic Treaty makes that very clear, that democracy, the rule of individual liberty, and the rule of law are the keystone principles for the alliance. And I think most experts would say that the fact that NATO is more than just a military alliance is one reason why it still exists today, even after the end of the Cold War. On the third question, the United States will remain actively engaged to the south of Europe. I think there's some question about the Biden administration, I think, would like to reduce the profile of the United States in the region, and perhaps there will be a different kind of focus there as well. The Biden administration will want to show support for Israel. I think it will want to have a relationship with Saudi Arabia, but will not want to depend as exclusively on Saudi Arabia in the region as the Trump administration has. The Biden administration will be much more critical of Saudi human rights practices. The Khashoggi experience is still very fresh in American minds, and I think that will show through in terms of criticism of Saudi Arabia in the future. I think that the United States will re-engage with the Iran deal. From domestic political purposes, the administration probably will have to ask for a renegotiation, and for that matter, Iran may want to have a renegotiation. In any case, I think that's an area where the United States will work very closely with the European participants in the agreement and try to head toward a new accord that can be sold in the United States as being in our interest, and will basically establish the approach that was attempted the first time around to slow down Iran's nuclear program and hopefully lead to, at some point, Iran actually not becoming a nuclear weapons state. That's only going to happen if Iran perceives itself as not being threatened by other countries. And so the politics of all of this in the long run are going to be important. But the technical aspects of the agreement in the near term are important. The West does have a good bit of leverage with Iran right now. and it could be used to get a very good agreement out of Iran. Iran's economy is devastated. It's in very bad shape. The combination of sanctions and perhaps its own mismanagement and COVID-19 put Iran in very bad condition. I've always felt that the Iran-U.S. relationship was a tragic one, because the Iranian American people actually have, I think, more in common than separates them. But the leadership of Iran has been, and again, I'm not going to go back to the history of how we got there. Part of that certainly was our fault, no question. Our support for the Shah way back when, and opposition to those who wanted to depose him, that established a very bad relationship. But I think there's reason to be hopeful for the future. The starting point, to my mind, is renegotiation of the Iran Accord. I think the Biden administration does also want to reduce the American troop presence in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but will want to do it under conditions that are constructive and progressive, and not dramatic, not dramatically pulling troops out, but doing it in a way that serves both international interests and those of the United States. So I think that's the I've covered those three questions. Do you have more?
In fact, the most question relates actually to issues which we have already covered. As you can notice, basically it's all about the future relationship between Europe and the United States, which is basically at the core of the West, so to say, and how a democratic president will actually manage to repair the transatlantic partnership. But also, I see actually a question which actually just arrived at that minute. Let me dictate it to you, and that is also related to Joe Biden. So would Joe Biden maintain the current US policy to curb China's global expansionism? So the expectation on that side of the Atlantic is obviously that the rise of China would not be necessarily only a positive, will not necessarily have only a positive impact. And then there is another question: would Joe Biden continue to address China's massive domestic human rights violation? And I think that was one issue that we could not touch upon during the last 60 minutes, but has a lot to do with one of your books, which is the book on illiberalism, because it's not just about democracy and rule of governance, it's also very much about human rights violations, right? So what is your take, how we are going to tackle these issues collectively as the West, or how do you think a US president such as Joe Biden would actually make a difference in that matter?
Well, as I suggested earlier, the first step of the Biden administration will be to try to develop more common approaches with the allies to dealing with China. And I think that any collective approach will have to have some focus on human rights. I think that there is a strong interest in human rights in Europe and in the United States, and that the Biden administration will want to do that. Whether the administration will want to do it to the point of actually producing divisions inside in the relationship between China and the West, I think is another question. I think they'll try to approach it with a somewhat subtle approach, and I think Europeans will want to do that as well. Well, I see good grounds for the United States and Europe agreeing on ways to criticize and point out China's violations of human rights without necessarily breaking the overall possibilities for cooperation with China. The Chinese military expansion is something that will remain of concern to the United States. It probably should be of concern to Europeans as well, even though members of the European Union are not engaged in the South China Sea area or in Asia at all, really. There may be some attempt by the administration to suggest that Europeans could show some greater interest in managing the rise of China from a strategic military point of view. And that could be a difficult thing to discuss in the alliance. But on the other hand, I think we've seen the first step in NATO in London last year to at least mentioning the challenges posed by China. And so I think that the discussion is going to continue moving in that direction under a Biden government.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we managed to extensively cover all relevant and important issues. And I would like to thank you very much for your open and really honest way of addressing the issues and giving us such comprehensive replies. I would like to also draw the attention of our listeners or watchers to your recent book, Defense of the West, Transatlantic Security from Truman to Trump. The book is available. You can purchase it, and I can strongly recommend it to all our listeners to buy it. And I am looking forward. Yes, that's the book. A little bit to your left. To your left. Yes.
There we go.
Yeah. And Stan is also, you can find Stan on Twitter as well. He's really engaging with, people who are interested in his topics and have questions. So you can find him on Twitter as well. And I'm looking forward to your next participation, to your next visit to Europe, where we will address, hopefully, the issues that will be arising following the US election. And we all hope for a very positive developments, particularly when it comes to the relationship between Europe and United States, as we all know that this relationship is at the core of the transatlantic community and will be very decisive also for the future of the West when it comes to facing all these challenges right now. Thank you very much, and stay safe and sound.
Velina, thank you very much. My pleasure to work with you again. And let me make one more comment about the book. If you buy the book, you not only get Stan Sloan, you get a magnificent foreword written by Sir Lawrence Freedman. And so it's a double benefit. But again, I look forward to my return to Europe when the conditions allow. And as you know, I love Vienna and look forward to returning to Vienna at some point in the future. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Stan.